Okay, Ben, so here we are with part two. Um, okay, so we last finished talking about the Holy Roman Empire and how the popes um, formed alliances with surrounding states to provide checks and balances on the Holy Roman Emperor's authority. Now we're going to look at what was happening at a similar time in France and England. So there was a development of regional monarchies. What I mean by this is that in the absence of an effective imperial power, um, there were these regional states that emerged throughout medieval Europe. And in France and England, these regional monarchies developed, and all over the countryside, regional monarchies. And they were pretty much the relationships between lords and their retainers. But we'll get into more detail now. So, we'll start with France. So in France, the French monarchy grew slowly from fairly humble beginnings. So when what we talked about before, the last Carolingians died, the lords of France elected a minor noble named Hugh Capet to serve as the king. So he had some territory around Paris, and some of his retainers were a lot more powerful than he was. But over the next 3 centuries, his descendants became known as the Capetian kings. So this is what I want you to remember. The Capetian kings, they expanded their political influence and established the right to administer justice throughout the French realm. So by the early 14th century, the Capetian kings had gradually centralized power and authority in France. So we have pretty much a kingdom in France, a kingdom that was managed by these Capetian kings. These Capetian kings, who were the descendants of Hugh Capet. So in England, the monarchy developed quite differently. So the founders were these people called the Normans. And the Normans were the descendants of the Vikings. The Vikings, of course, who came from Scandinavia. And they carved out a state on the peninsula of Normandy in France. Now, Normandy is where the people landed on D-Day, so it's on the coast of France and it's quite close to England. So these Vikings, these Normans, carved out a state on the peninsula of Normandy in France during the 9th century, and these Dukes of Normandy, they built a tightly centralized state in which all authority stemmed from the dukes themselves. So the dukes retained the title, land in all Normandy, and strictly limited the rights of the retainers to grant land to others. And in 1066, Duke William of Normandy invaded England. Okay, so now we're going from Normandy, the coast of France, to England, and then ruled the descendants of. So 1066, Duke William of Normandy invaded England, and at this time, England was ruled by the descendants of the Saxons. England was ruled by the Anglo-Saxons, of course, and other Germanic peoples. So these Vikings, these Normans who were descendants of the Vikings, invaded. And following a speedy military victory, they beat the Anglo-Saxons. The Duke, known as William the Conqueror now, so it's Duke William, became known as William the Conqueror. He introduced Norman principles of government and land tenure to England and quickly established a tightly centralized realm. So we get these monarchical principles that I was talking about up here finally established in England now, 1066. So both the Capetians and the Normans, they faced internal challenges from the retainers, who were seeking to pursue independent policies to enlarge their powers, and both dynasties also faced external challenges and battled each other. But both the Normans and the Capetians, they managed to organize regional monarchies that maintained order and provided a reasonably good government. Okay, just a quick rundown of what was happening in Italy and Iberia at this time. Okay, so we know where Italy is. Italy's the shoe, remember? The boot at the bottom of Europe. And Iberia is Portugal and Spain. So we've got France up here, obviously, Portugal and Spain here. This is called Iberia, or the Iberian Peninsula. So we got Italy here and Iberia there. So in Italy, what was happening? So we get the formation of regional states forming in Italy as well, but not on the scale of what was happening in France and England. So in Italy, there was some city-states and principalities that had pretty much been established by the 12th century. They were quite prosperous, like Florence, Bologna, Genoa, Milan, and Venice. They had their own urban districts, but also the surrounding hinterland. So these were city-states. And you also get a Norman invasion. And they invaded territories still claimed by the Byzantine Empire, and other Muslims. So the Byzantine Empire and various Muslim states, they existed in southern Italy. So you get the Normans invading there, and they overcame the Byzantine and Muslim authorities. and they brought southern Italy into the orbit of the Roman Catholic Christianity and laid the foundations for the emergence of the powerful kingdom of Naples. In Iberia, similarly, from the 8th to the 11th centuries, you have Muslim conquerors ruling most of this peninsula, except for a few small states in northern Spain. Okay, so Muslim conquerors are ruling most of this. Beginning in the mid-11th century, though, Christian adventurers from these northern states began to attack the Muslim territories and enlarge their own domains. And by the 13th century, Christian kingdoms controlled most of the Iberian Peninsula. So, very similar story in Italy and the Iberian Peninsula. You get the defeat of the Muslim peoples. Okay, now we're going to sort of look at more the social structure. So, in this period, after the Carolingian Empire dissolved, that big empire, the European nobles had little choice but to take responsibility for maintaining order in their own territories, okay? So although most nobles owed allegiance to a higher authority, in reality they acted with growing independence. They collected fees, they collected rents, and they administered local affairs and mobilized armed forces and decided legal disputes. So I've talked a bit about lords and retainers. Now, what are these? So, to organize the territories that they had, the lords, the local nobles, the lords, they built military and political relationships with other prominent individuals in their territories, and in doing so, they mobilized small private armies by attracting armed retainers into their service with grants of land or money. So what the retainers did was they organized local public work projects, they resolved disputes, and they administered justice. In exchange, the retainers owed loyalty, obedience, and military service to their lords. So there was a good relationship between the lords and the retainers. So the lords and the retainers, they merged into kind of a hereditary noble class that lived off the surplus agricultural production it extracted from the cultivators or the serfs. So because this political relationship occurred on a local scale, we call this a decentralized society. So another thing that accompanied this decentralized political order was the creation during the mid-7th century of a new category of peasants called serfs. Okay, so the serfs were not slaves subject to sale, but neither were they fully free. So not slaves, not free. Instead, they were allocated by the landlords or the lords a certain portion of land to farm, and in exchange required both labor services as well as a portion of in exchange the lords, they required both labor services as well as a portion of the serf's harvest. So male serfs, for example, they typically worked about 3 days a week in the fields of their lords and provided additional labour services during planting and harvesting seasons, while the women, they churned butter, made cheese, and they brewed beer, spun thread and wove cloth and such. So the serfs had very little opportunity to move to different lands. They were pretty much tied to their lords, and they were only allowed to move really with the permission of their lord. They even had to pay a fee to marry a serf who worked for a different land. So they had very limited freedom. So the introduction of serfdom encouraged the development of the manor. Okay, the manor as the principal form of agricultural organization in Western Europe. You must have heard of manors before. So what a manor is, was a large estate that consisted of fields, meadows, forests, domestic animals, and serfs who were bound to the land. Okay, so the lord of the manor was a prominent political or military figure who provided government, administration, and justice for the manor. So you can see what I mean about a local decentralized society. All the political and military organization was occurring on a local level, not in a centralized level. So very, very juxtaposed to the Holy Roman Empire that we talked about before, which was very centralized. It had and Napoleon, the empires that characterized the 17th and 18th century, Napoleon's empire and the British Empire, and that very decentralized, run by lords and manors, individual manors. So yeah, in the absence of thriving cities, the manors became largely self-sufficient communities. Okay, largely self-sufficient. So they were like little towns. The lords of the manors, they maintained mills, bakeries, breweries, wineries, and the serfs produced most of the iron tools and the leather goods and that. And this helped fuel quite impressive economic growth in Western Europe. So, for example, the European peoples, they expanded the use of water mills and heavy plows, and there was inventions of new crops and tools. Um, there was the horseshoe and the horse collar that was invented around this time, both of which increased the efficiency of agricultural labor. And by the 13th century, um, experimentation with new crops and new techniques had vastly increased the understanding of agricultural affairs, crop rotation, nitrogen fixing, and of course this led to agricultural productivity and eventually population growth. So manor led to new tools and technologies, increased agricultural production, which in turn led to population growth. So during the centuries from about 1000 to 1300, the European diets expanded from almost complete reliance on grains in 1000 to include meat, dairy products, fish, vegetables, and legumes such as beans and peas by 1300. And this increased agricultural productivity supported rapid population growth. For example, by the year 1000, um, when regional states had ended invasions and restored order, Europe's population was 36 million. So 300 years later, in 1300, the population had reached 79 million. So rapid demographic growth that in turn stimulated revival of towns and trades in medieval Europe. Here's an example of a manor house. So we get the Lord. He's watching his labourers plant grapevines and pick grapes, and this is a typical of the a typical manor house of the late 1400s. Yeah, so due to the population growth, you get in this period, you get a revival of towns and trade. So increased urbanization. So by about 1000 AD, European society was able to support large numbers of urban residents, people flocking from the countryside to cities. You get cities founded during Roman times, such as Paris and London, becoming thriving centres of government, and you also get new urban centres such as Venice in Italy, in northern Italy. Urbanisation. Increased textile production. We kind of touched on this when we were doing the Industrial Revolution. The growth of towns and cities, they brought about increasing specialisation of labour, which turned to manufacturing, or proto-industrial revolution. And textile production was a big one. As we mentioned when we were doing the Industrial Revolution essay, textile production was very big in the Mediterranean, Italy and that, until the British took it over. So all these changes that we're talking about in the decentralized system with the manors and the serfs and the nobles, this is what we typically call the feudal system. So it was the basis for both holding land and raising armies from the mid-9th century onwards. So it was about hierarchy. Hierarchy of kings and nobles and knights and peasants, where everyone owed allegiance to someone. So we talked about the kings were obviously on top, but the nobles built up significant local power bases. The nobles, sort of had kind of a detached allegiance to the kings, but they built up significant local power bases, which is what we just talked about, and they were able to act with almost complete independence. A vassal was obliged to fight for their lord or king in exchange for land, which is often called a fiefdom. Vassals being retainers, as we talked about. And the vassals raised their troops from the land, and the troops were mostly unwilling peasant conscripts, known as serfs, as we talked about. And yeah, so the backbone of the feudal system was that there was a hierarchy, the serfs on the bottom, the kings and the king's on top, and everyone owed allegiance to someone. And here's a good diagram showing the feudal balance of power. Another way of looking at it is through a model called the Three Estates. So the Three Estates were those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. Those who prayed were the clergy of the Roman Catholic Church, from lowly parish priests to bishops to cardinals and popes. The fighters came from the ranks of nobles. They inherited their positions in society and received education and skills in military arts. And those who worked, of course, were the majority of the population, the peasants or serfs. And of course, this shows, the marked political, social, and economic inequality that characterized medieval Europe. We also see an emergence of chivalry. So this is within the ranks of nobles, an emphasis on chivalry and courtly behavior gradually introduced expectations of high ethical standards and refined manners that encourage warriors to become cultivated leaders of society. Code of ethics and behavior considered appropriate for nobles. For example, like typical behavior was a knight by the 12th century, was a knight who would commonly place his sword on a church altar and pledge his service to God. That was a big part of chivalry. And the noble who observed the chivalric code would devote himself to the causes of order and piety and the Christian faith. So, one of the most important developments of the early Middle Ages was the conversion of Western Europe to Roman Christianity. The Franks, the popes, and the monasteries played very important roles in bringing about the conversion. The adoption of Roman Christianity ensured that medieval Europe would inherit crucial cultural elements from classical Roman society, including the Latin language and the institutional Roman Church. So this guided European thought on religion, moral, and ethical matters. So there were rituals, of course, Christian rituals to do with birth, marriage, and death. Most of the art, literature, and music of the Middle Ages drew from Christian doctrines and stories. Just as mosques define the skylines of Muslim cities, the spires of the churches and the cathedrals dominated the landscape of medieval Europe. So Western Christianity also changed in various ways during the Middle Ages. As the Roman Catholic Church developed an identity, Western theologians became reacquainted with the works of Aristotle, the philosopher, and produced impressive, Aristotelian philosophy and Christian values. So So, as you can imagine, um, this for example is Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. I've actually been here, and I've seen this building and been inside it, and I was actually there for a ceremony, and it is actually quite amazing. It's you, you get like, I mean, I'm as atheist as anyone else, but you get like a tingle down your spine, um, being inside it and seeing how magnificent it is. So these buildings popped up all over Europe in the 12th and 13th centuries, when European Christianity was really spreading. And you can imagine the thoughts and feelings that it would have evoked in the local populace, and how it would have increased faith being inside, um, and seeing these magnificent religious structures. Sort of like would have given hope in times of, you know, pestilence and famine and desperation. And of course, this in turn further helped the spread of Christianity through Europe. Okay, during this time we get a medieval expansion of Europe as well. So during the High Middle Ages, um, powerful states and economic expansion and demographic growth all strengthened European society, while church officials encouraged the colonization of pagan and Muslim lands. Pagan meaning like, you know, their own kind of like small religions, so just conquering other religions. And this was a way to extend the influence of Roman Catholic Christianity. So beginning about the mid 11th century, Europeans embarked on expansive ventures to the Atlantic, the Baltic, and the Mediterranean, um, signaling clearly that Europeans were beginning to play a much larger role in the affairs of the Eastern Hemisphere than they had during the early Middle Ages. So Europe was bouncing back essentially. So and these ventures in the name of Christianity were known as, of course, the Crusades. So the term crusade refers to holy war. It's from the Latin word crux, meaning cross. And when a pope declared a crusade, warriors would take up the cross as a symbol of their faith, and sew strips of cloth on the form of cross on the backs of their garments, and fight on behalf of Christianity. The most famous of the Crusades were the enormous expeditions of the Roman Catholic Christians, mounted in an effort to recapture Palestine and the holy city of Jerusalem from Muslim authorities. So Palestine, remember, is modern day Israel. So that's kind of in the near Middle East, kind of close to where Mesopotamia is. So kind of close to Europe and the sort of Mediterranean basin. So Pope Urban II launched these crusades in 1095. And the response to Urban's appeal was immediate and enthusiastic. A preacher travelled through France and Germany and the Low Countries, whipping up huge support from like poor knights and enthusiastic peasants, including women, and they set out for Palestine without training or discipline or weapons or supplies. But not surprisingly, of course, their campaign was a disaster, and many of the band died, and very few made it back to Europe. But this indicated that there was a high level of interest, that the crusading idea was very popular among the European public. Okay, so the first official crusade was French and Norman nobles organizing a more respectable military expedition to Palestine in late 1096. The crusading armies, they began a long trek to Palestine. In 1097 and 98, they captured Edessa, Antioch, and in 1099 they got Jerusalem, so it was very successful. Jerusalem fell, the capital of Palestine, or modern-day Israel if you like, and then they proceeded to extend their conquests and carve conquered territories into Christian states. So the quick victories came largely because of division and disarray in the ranks of the Muslim foes. Okay, so Muslims, as you know, there are all these different sects that all hate each other. There's Shiite and Sunni, and God knows what. That's so they'll blow each other up. So it was this disarray and division in the Muslim ranks that led to the Crusades being successful. However, this encouraged the Turks and the Egyptians and other Muslims to settle their differences and come together to fight and expel the European Christians. So by the mid-12th century, the mid-1100s, the Crusader communities had come under quite a lot of pressure. And the Crusader state of Edessa fell to Turks in 1144, and Jerusalem was recaptured in 1187. So by the Muslims. So unfortunately, yeah, that all went to shit for the Crusaders in the end. So by the mid-13th century, the Europeans had launched 5 major crusades, but none of the later ventures really succeeded in re-establishing Christian presence in Palestine. So it was only the first one, that one there, the 1096 one, that was successful. The Fourth Crusade was terrible, for example, went badly astray. And yeah. So, Western European society experienced massive change from 500 to 1300. So, rulers of medieval Europe were, however, unable to reinstate an imperial form of government for long. Okay? So we talk about the decentralized thing. And for centuries they did not participate actively in the larger trading world of the Eastern Hemisphere. So Europe was very isolated due to internal turmoil. Yet Western Europeans found ways to maintain relative order and stability by decentralizing political responsibilities. and relying on local authorities and regional states for political organization. So the development of self-sufficient manners allowed Western Europe to expand agricultural production, which in turn spurred population growth as well as trade. Western Christianity preserved elements of classical Roman society, established the foundation for unity in Western Europe. Western Europe underwent political and economical reorganization in the later Middle Ages. Regional states maintained good order and fostered rapid economic growth. Agricultural improvements brought increased food supplies. Urbanization, manufacturing, and trade followed. And they traded actively throughout the Mediterranean, Baltic, Northern Sea. And the Roman Catholic Church prospered. And advanced educational institutions reinforced the influence of Christianity throughout Europe. Christianity, there were church officials that encouraged crusades to conquer pagan and Muslim lands. And even the absence of strong imperial powers, by 1300 Western European peoples had strengthened their own society and began in various ways to interact regularly with counterparts in other regions of the Eastern Hemisphere.